Picture this, a sold-out stadium, 80,000 screaming fans, lights dimmed to absolute darkness, and somewhere behind that massive curtain, 7 men are locked into rituals so personal, so deeply ingrained, that missing even one of them would feel like walking into battle without armor. We're talking about BTS, the biggest act on the planet, and what they do in those final, nerve-wracking minutes before the stage lights explode is nothing short of fascinating. But here's the thing most people never ask. After performing over 1,000 concerts across 4 continents, why would they still feel the need for pre-show rituals at all? Shouldn't the nerves be gone by now? Shouldn't muscle memory just take over? And what if I told you that one member's ritual is so physically intense it leaves him drenched in sweat before a single note is even played? Or that another member does something so quiet, so devastatingly emotional, that even the staff learned to never interrupt him during those moments? What drives a global superstar to whisper the same phrase into the mirror night after night, city after city, as if the words themselves hold some kind of invisible power? And why does one member insist on a habit that his own bandmates once called weird, before they realized it was the very thing holding his confidence together? These aren't just quirky backstage habits. These are the psychological anchors that separate a good performance from a legendary one. So buckle up, because we're about to pull back the curtain on the 7 sacred pre-show rituals of BTS, and trust me, number 1 is going to hit you right in the chest. Let's get into it. Number 7, Jimin, the joke that holds everything together. You know what's wild? In a world where pre-show rituals usually involve meditation, vocal warm-ups, or some kind of intense mental preparation, Kim Seokjin, the eldest member of BTS, chose comedy. That's right. While most artists are pacing backstage with furrowed brows and noise-canceling headphones, Jimin is standing in the middle of the dressing room, delivering the corniest, most painfully predictable dad jokes you've ever heard in your life. And he does this every single time without exception. We're not talking about a casual chuckle here and there. We're talking about a deliberate, systematic, almost militant campaign to make every person in that room crack a smile before anyone sets foot on that stage. And here's the part that makes this more than just a funny backstage quirk. It actually works, and there's real science behind why. Let's set the scene. It's 2018. BTS is backstage at London's O2 Arena during the Love Yourself World Tour, their first ever European stadium leg. The pressure is astronomical. This isn't Seoul or Tokyo where the crowd dynamics are familiar. This is a brand new territory, tens of thousands of Western fans who've been waiting years, some who flew in from countries BTS had never even visited. The members are visibly tense. Jimin is stretching in the corner with that look on his face, the one ARMY knows too well, where his jaw is set tight and his eyes are locked on the floor. RM is reviewing setlist notes, muttering lyrics under his breath. Suga is sitting alone with his eyes closed. The energy in that room is heavy, almost suffocating. And then Jimin walks in from the makeup chair, looks dead into Jungkook's eyes, and says, with the most serious face imaginable, "What do you call a fake noodle?" An impasta. Dead silence. 3 full seconds of nothing. And then Jungkook snorts. Not a polite laugh, not a courtesy chuckle, a full, involuntary snort that breaks the tension like a hammer through glass. J-Hope immediately starts cackling. Jimin covers his face, V throws his head back, and even Suga, who prides himself on being unshakable, lets out this tiny, barely visible grin that the behind-the-scenes cameras caught in the Burn the Stage documentary. That single moment shifted the entire energy of the room. The tightness in everyone's shoulders visibly dropped. The atmosphere went from a pressure cooker to a living room hangout in less than 10 seconds. And Jimin? He didn't even smile. He just nodded, satisfied, like a general who'd just executed a flawless tactical maneuver. Now here's where this gets genuinely fascinating from a psychological standpoint. There's a well-documented phenomenon in performance psychology called pre-performance anxiety contagion, and it's exactly what it sounds like. When one person in a group starts radiating nervous energy, it spreads to everyone else like a virus. In ensemble performances, this is especially dangerous because synchronized groups like BTS rely on collective energy, not just individual skill. If one member is tight, the choreography feels off. If two members are anxious, the vocal harmonies lose their warmth. And if the whole group is locked in their own heads, the audience can feel it, even from the nosebleed seats. What Jin does with his jokes is essentially a psychological circuit breaker. Laughter triggers the release of endorphins and simultaneously reduces cortisol, the stress hormone, creating a neurochemical shift that literally loosens the muscles and clears mental fog. Jin isn't just being funny. He's performing an act of emotional leadership that most people never recognize because it's wrapped in the disguise of a terrible pun. And the thing is, this wasn't always his role. If you go back to BTS's early days, 2013, 2014, the behind-the-scenes footage tells a completely different story. Jin was the quiet one backstage. He was the member who sat in the corner reviewing choreography on his phone because he'd joined Big Hit Entertainment as an acting trainee, not a dancer, and the gap between his skill level and the others haunted him constantly. He's spoken about this openly in multiple interviews, the feeling of being the one who couldn't keep up, the member who had to practice 3 times as hard just to match what J-Hope or Jimin could do instinctively. The anxiety he carried before performances in those early years was crushing. He's admitted that during their debut era, he would sometimes feel physically sick before going on stage, not because of the crowd, but because of the fear of making a mistake that would drag the group down. So when did the shift happen? When did the anxious eldest Taehyung become the backstage comedian who holds the emotional temperature of the group in his hands? According to multiple accounts from both the members and their staff, it started around 2015 and 2016, during the HYYH era. As BTS's stages grew bigger and the stakes grew higher, Jin realized something critical. His own anxiety was feeding into the group's collective nervousness. He couldn't outperform everyone in dance or vocal technique, but he could do something none of them could. He could make them laugh on command. It became his superpower, his unique contribution to the group dynamic that went far beyond singing or visual appeal. The members have talked about this countless times. RM once said in a V-Live that Jin Hyung's jokes aren't funny because they're good, they're funny because he commits to them so hard that you can't help but react. Jimin mentioned during a fan sign event that on the rare occasions Jin doesn't crack a joke before a show, the whole group feels off, like something essential is missing from the ritual. Even Bang Si-hyuk, the founder of Big Hit, acknowledged in an interview that Jin's role as the emotional stabilizer of the group is one of the most underrated factors in BTS's live performance consistency. Think about that for a second. The CEO of the company is publicly saying that dad jokes are a measurable factor in why BTS delivers night after night. That's not comedy, that's strategy. That's emotional intelligence operating at an elite level, disguised as a guy who thinks, what do you call a bear with no teeth? A gummy bear is peak humor. And it's not just the jokes themselves, it's the timing. Multiple staff members who've worked BTS tours have noted that Jin has an almost supernatural ability to read the room. He doesn't fire off jokes the moment he walks in. He waits. He observes. He identifies who's carrying the most tension, and then he targets them specifically. If Jimin is spiraling into perfectionism about a dance break, Jin will walk over and say something so absurd that Jimin's brain literally cannot hold both the anxiety and the joke at the same time. If Jungkook is putting too much pressure on himself to hit a high note, Jin will casually challenge him to a rock-paper-scissors game with the most ridiculous stakes imaginable. It's precision comedy, deployed not for laughs, but for survival. Because in the high-pressure world of global touring, where one bad night can become a viral moment for all the wrong reasons, the ability to reset your team's emotional state in 60 seconds flat is worth more than any vocal coach or choreography session. So the next time you see a BTS concert clip and wonder why they look so relaxed, so genuinely joyful, so effortlessly connected to each other and the audience, remember that somewhere in the minutes before that footage was taken, a 30-something-year-old man stood in a dressing room and told a joke so bad that it physically hurt, and in doing so, he unlocked every door that anxiety had tried to close. That's Kim Seokjin. That's the joke that holds everything together. But here's what I need you to think about. If Jin handles the group's emotional reset through laughter, What happens when one member needs to go completely silent before a show? What if the ritual isn't about releasing tension at all, but about sinking deeper into it on purpose? Say next for number 6, and I promise you, this one's going to change the way you think about focus. Number 6, Suga, the silent rehearsal no one is allowed to interrupt. If Jin's ritual is about filling the room with noise, Min Youngie's ritual is about draining every last drop of it. And when I say silence, I don't mean he just gets a little quiet. I mean the man constructs an invisible fortress around himself so absolute, so impenetrable, that even the members, his brothers of over a decade, know better than to knock on that wall. This is Suga's sacred pre-show protocol, and it is, without exaggeration, one of the most disciplined mental preparation routines you'll find in the entire music industry. Not just K-pop, the entire global music industry. And the craziest part? He doesn't meditate. He doesn't pray. He doesn't chant affirmations. He listens to the full set list of that night's concert, front to back, in complete isolation, while mentally performing every single song in his head, every rap verse, every piano transition, every breath mark, every moment where he needs to move from one part of the stage to another. He runs the entire concert in his mind before he runs it with his body. And if anyone interrupts him before he finishes, he starts over. From the beginning. Every single time. Let's talk about what this actually looks like in practice, because the behind-the-scenes footage only gives you fragments. According to multiple accounts from BTS's touring staff, sound engineers, stylists, stage managers who've worked with them across multiple world tours, Suga's pre-show routine begins approximately 90 minutes before showtime. That's significantly earlier than most of the other members start their own rituals. He finds a spot, sometimes a separate room if one's available, sometimes just a corner of the main dressing room, puts in his in-ear monitors, the same custom-molded ones he'll wear on stage, pulls up the exact set list for that specific night on his phone, and presses play. From that moment, he is gone. Not kind of zoned out gone. Not scrolling his phone while music plays in the background gone. He is neurologically elsewhere. His eyes are open but unfocused. His fingers occasionally twitch against his thigh as if pressing piano keys or gripping a microphone, and his lips move in barely perceptible micro-movements as he silently mouths every lyric, every ad-lib, every crowd interaction cue. Staff members have described it as watching someone sleepwalk through a performance that hasn't happened yet. It's eerie. It's mesmerizing. And it is absolutely non-negotiable. Now here's where the psychology gets really interesting. What Suga is doing has a formal name in sports and performance science. It's called mental imagery rehearsal, or visualization, and it's the exact same technique used by Olympic athletes, fighter pilots, and elite surgeons before high-stakes performances. The research on this is staggering. A landmark study published in the Journal of Sport and Exercise Psychology found that athletes who combined physical practice with systematic mental rehearsal outperformed those who only practiced physically by a measurable margin. The brain, it turns out, doesn't fully distinguish between a vividly imagined action and a physically executed one. The same neural pathways fire, the same motor planning regions activate, and the same emotional regulation circuits engage. When Suga sits in that corner and runs through Mic Drop, or Black Swan, or Day Tweeta in his mind, his brain is literally performing. His neural architecture is laying down the same grooves it will need 90 minutes later when 60,000 people are screaming his name. By the time he actually walks on stage, his body has already done the show once. The live performance becomes the second run, and second runs are always smoother. But this isn't just some technique Suga picked up from a performance coach or a self-help book. This ritual was born from pain, real, raw, career-threatening pain. Let's rewind to 2013. BTS has just debuted, and Min Youngie is carrying a weight that most 19-year-olds can't even conceptualize. Before Big Hit, he was an underground rapper in Daegu, a city that the soul-centric music industry barely acknowledged. He'd chosen music over his family's wishes, burning bridges with his father who wanted him to pursue a stable career. He was so broke during his trainee days that he survived on a diet that he's publicly described as 1 meal a day if I was lucky. He developed a shoulder injury from an accident while working a part-time delivery job to pay rent, an injury that would haunt him for years and eventually require surgery in 2020. And on top of all of this physical and financial hardship, he was battling depression and social anxiety that he would later lay bare in tracks like The Last and First Love. Performing live for Young Youngie wasn't exhilarating, it was terrifying. Not because of the crowds, but because of the internal voice telling him he wasn't good enough, that he was a fraud, that the underground scene he'd abandoned would never forgive him for selling out to an idol group. The mental rehearsal ritual started as a survival mechanism, a way to pre-experience the performance in a controlled, private environment where failure had no witnesses. If he could get through the show in his mind without breaking, he could get through it on stage. Over the years, this coping mechanism evolved into something far more sophisticated. By the Wings tour in 2017, Suga had refined his visualization to include not just the musical performance, but the spatial logistics of the stage, where the lifts were, when the pyrotechnics would fire, which camera angles he'd need to be aware of for the live broadcast feed. During the Love Yourself era, he added emotional markers, specific moments in certain songs where he would intentionally summon a particular feeling to enhance his delivery. For First Love, he'd visualize the old piano in his childhood home. For Interlude, Shadow, he'd recall the panic attacks he experienced during BTS's explosive 2018-2019 rise, channeling that genuine fear into a performance that critics have called one of the most raw and honest moments in K-pop concert history. This isn't just rehearsal, this is emotional architecture. He's building the entire inner world of the concert before a single spotlight turns on. The members have all spoken about Suga's silence with a mixture of respect and slight bewilderment. J-Hope once joked in a behind-the-scenes segment that Hyung's pre-show mode is like a computer running a program. You can see the processing light blinking, but if you try to open another application, the whole system crashes. Jungkook mentioned in a Weverse interview that during their early touring days, he once made the mistake of tapping Suga on the shoulder during his listening session to ask about a choreography change. And the look Suga gave him was so quietly intense that Jungkook never did it again. It wasn't anger. It wasn't irritation. It was something deeper, like being pulled out of a dream you desperately needed to finish. RM, who arguably understands Suga's creative process better than anyone, has described it as Youngie's way of making peace with the stage before he has to fight on it. That description is poetic, but it's also clinically accurate. What Suga is doing in those 90 minutes is resolving every potential source of onstage anxiety before it has a chance to manifest. He's pre-solving problems. He's pre-feeling emotions. He's pre-living the concert so thoroughly that when the real thing begins, there are no surprises, only confirmations. And here's the detail that elevates this from impressive to genuinely extraordinary. He adjusts the visualization for every single show. This isn't a generic mental template he recycles. Each venue has different acoustics, different stage dimensions, different crowd energy patterns. A dome show in Japan feels completely different from an outdoor stadium in Los Angeles or a European arena with a low ceiling and aggressive reverb. Suga accounts for all of it. He reviews the stage layout diagrams that the production team distributes, notes the positions of the extended runways and B stages, and incorporates those spatial details into his mental run-through. During the Permission to Dance on Stage concerts in 2021 and 2022, crew members noticed that Suga was spending additional time studying the LED screen configurations because the visual effects had become so complex that they affected the timing of certain stage movements. He was, in essence, doing the work of a stage director, a lighting technician, and a performer simultaneously, all inside his own head, in total silence, with his eyes half closed in a folding chair. The result? Suga is widely regarded as one of the most consistent live performers in BTS, not the most explosive, not the most visually dramatic, but the most consistent. Night after night, city after city, his delivery barely fluctuates. His timing is surgical. His energy allocation is perfectly calibrated. He knows exactly when to hold back and when to detonate. And that consistency isn't natural talent alone. It's the product of a man who refuses to walk onto any stage without having already conquered it in his mind. That silent corner, those closed eyes, those twitching fingers, that's where the real concert begins. The one the audience sees is just the echo. Now, if Suga's ritual is about controlling the mind through silence, what happens when a member's ritual is about controlling the body through words? What if the most powerful thing you can do before facing 80,000 strangers is talk, not to them, not to your team, but to yourself? And what if the words he chooses reveal something about his leadership that no interview has ever fully captured? Say, next for number 5, because this one goes deep. Number 5, RM. The words he whispers when no one's watching. There's a moment, roughly 30 minutes before every BTS concert, where Kim Namjoon disappears. Not physically. He's still in the venue, still backstage, still technically reachable. But mentally, emotionally, spiritually, he's somewhere else entirely. And if you happen to walk past the bathroom, or the quiet hallway behind the staging area, or whatever small pocket of solitude he's carved out for himself that night, you'll catch something that stops you cold. The leader of the biggest band on the planet, standing alone, talking to himself. Not mumbling, not rehearsing lyrics. Talking full sentences, deliberate cadence, eyes locked on his own reflection or fixed on some invisible point in the middle distance, delivering what can only be described as a private speech to an audience of one. And the content of those words? That's what makes this ritual not just interesting, but genuinely revelatory about the kind of leader Namjoon has become. Let's get the obvious question out of the way. Yes, self-talk is a recognized technique in performance psychology. Athletes do it. Public speakers do it. CEOs do it before boardroom presentations. The clinical term is motivational self-talk or instructional self-talk, depending on whether the focus is emotional regulation or task-specific cueing. Research published in the European Journal of Social Psychology has demonstrated that structured self-talk can improve performance by up to 25% in high-pressure scenarios, primarily because it engages the prefrontal cortex, the brain's executive control center, and helps override the amygdala's panic response. In simpler terms, when you talk to yourself with intention, you're essentially giving your rational brain a loudspeaker while turning down the volume on your fear brain. It's neuroscience dressed up as a quirky habit. But here's the thing, what RM does goes way beyond the standard self-talk protocol that a sports psychologist might prescribe. His version is layered, philosophical, and deeply rooted in a personal history that most fans only know fragments of. Multiple sources, staff members, the members themselves, and RM's own admissions in interviews and live broadcasts have painted a remarkably consistent picture of what this ritual looks like. RM doesn't recite a fixed script. He doesn't repeat the same affirmation like a mantra. Instead, he speaks to himself contextually, addressing whatever specific fear, doubt, or responsibility is weighing on him for that particular show. And the language he uses shifts depending on the stakes. During a routine tour stop, it might be grounding and calm, something along the lines of reminding himself why he's here, what the music means, what the fans in this specific city have been through to be in that arena tonight. But during milestone shows, debut performances at new venues, comeback stages, year-end award ceremonies, the United Nations General Assembly, the tone changes entirely. It becomes fiercer, more urgent, almost combative, as if he's arguing with an internal critic who's trying to convince him he doesn't belong. Staff members who've overheard fragments have described it as sounding less like a pep talk and more like a closing argument in a trial where the defendant is his own self-worth. And this is where the backstory becomes essential, because you cannot understand this ritual without understanding what Namjoon has carried on his shoulders since he was 15 years old. RM wasn't just a member of BTS, he was the reason BTS existed in the first place. Bang Si-hyuk, the founder of Big Hit Entertainment, has stated publicly and repeatedly that the decision to form BTS was built around Namjoon. He was the foundation stone, a teenage underground rapper from Ilsan with an IQ reportedly measured at 148, who could write, produce, and perform at a level that seasoned artists twice his age couldn't match. But here's the weight that came with that. When BTS debuted in 2013 to lukewarm reception and industry skepticism, every failure felt like Namjoon's personal failure. When critics dismissed them as just another idol group, it was Namjoon who absorbed that judgment as the leader and the group's public spokesperson. When the company struggled financially in those early years and Big Hit was genuinely close to bankruptcy before BTS broke through, it was Namjoon who carried the unspoken knowledge that if this group failed, it wouldn't just end 7 careers. It would collapse an entire company and the livelihoods of everyone who worked there. That's an existential burden that most 20-year-olds would buckle under. And in many ways, Namjoon did buckle, privately, invisibly, in ways that only surfaced years later in lyrics and confessional V-Lives. He's spoken openly about the identity crisis that hit him during BTS's transition from hip-hop-focused rookies to global pop icons. The underground rap community, the world that had shaped his artistic identity, turned on him viciously after debut. They called him a sellout, a fake, a traitor to real hip-hop. Online forums tore apart his credibility. Former collaborators distanced themselves publicly. And Namjoon internalized all of it. In his 2015 mixtape, he included lines that were essentially open wounds set to music, confessions of feeling lost between the rapper he wanted to be and the idol the industry demanded he become. The self-talk ritual, according to what can be pieced together from various interviews and behind-the-scenes moments, began crystallizing during this exact period. It started not as motivation, but as self-negotiation, a nightly conversation with himself about whether the compromises he was making were worth it, whether the path he'd chosen was authentic, whether the version of Kim Namjoon standing in that mirror was someone the 15-year-old kid from Ilsan would recognize or respect. Over the years, as BTS ascended from mid-tier idols to global phenomenon, the content of those self-conversations evolved. By the Wings tour in 2017, staff noticed that RM's pre-show self-talk had shifted from self-doubt management to purpose reinforcement. He wasn't asking himself, "Am I good enough?" anymore. He was reminding himself, "Why does this matter?" The distinction is enormous. One is defensive, the other is generative. One fights anxiety, the other builds meaning. And meaning, as any psychologist will tell you, is the single most powerful antidote to performance pressure. When you're performing because you're afraid of failure, every mistake feels catastrophic. But when you're performing because you've reconnected with the deeper purpose behind the work, mistakes become minor turbulence in a flight path that's still pointed true north. RM figured this out not through therapy or coaching, though he's been open about valuing both, but through the raw, repetitive process of standing alone and talking himself through it, night after night, city after city, continent after continent. The members' perspective on this ritual is particularly illuminating. Suga, in a moment of rare emotional candor during a festa dinner, once described RM's pre-show solitude as the price of being the leader. He said it matter-of-factly, without sentimentality, but the weight of the statement was unmistakable. Suga was acknowledging that Namjoon carries a psychological load that the other 6 members don't, and that the self-talk is how he metabolizes it before stepping into the light. Jin has mentioned noticing that RM's eyes look different after his self-talk sessions, clearer, he said, like someone who just made a decision. V, who is arguably the most emotionally perceptive member, once revealed that he secretly listened to a fragment of RM's self-talk through a door during the map of the Seoul tour preparations, and that what he heard moved him so deeply he had to walk away before RM noticed. V didn't share what the words were, and no one pressed him. Some things are sacred even within a group that shares almost everything. What makes this ritual truly extraordinary isn't just its psychological function, it's its longevity and consistency. RM has been doing this for over a decade. Through debut stages in front of a few hundred people. Through sold-out stadiums of 90,000. Through a speech at the United Nations where he addressed world leaders about the importance of self-love, an irony not lost on a man who has spent years learning to extend that same grace to himself. Through a global pandemic that forced concerts into empty rooms with only cameras for company. Through military enlistment and the anxiety of return. The setting changes, the stakes fluctuate, The audience shifts, but the ritual remains. 30 minutes before showtime, Kim Namjoon finds his solitude, faces himself, and speaks. Not to the crowd. Not to the camera. Not to ARMY. To the one person whose approval he's spent his entire career trying to earn, himself. And every night, by the time he finishes, the answer is the same: you belong here. This matters. Now go prove it. That's not a pre-show habit. That's a man rebuilding his own foundation in real time, brick by whispered brick, so that when the stage shakes under the weight of 80,000 voices, he doesn't crack. But now I want you to consider something completely different. What if a member's pre-show ritual has nothing to do with the mind or the voice, but with something you can feel in your chest before a single word is spoken? What if one member does something so raw, so emotionally naked, that even the hardened touring crew learned to give him space, not because he asked, but because what they witnessed felt too private to stand near? Say next for number 4, and trust me, this one hits different. Number 4, V, the music that has nothing to do with BTS. Here's something that doesn't make sense at first, and that's exactly why it's so powerful. In the final stretch before a BTS concert, while the rest of the members are locked into routines directly connected to the show they're about to perform, Kim Taehyung puts on his headphones and listens to music that has absolutely nothing to do with the setlist. Nothing to do with K-pop, and in many cases, nothing to do with any genre most people his age would even recognize. We're talking about Frank Sinatra. We're talking about jazz standards from the 1950s. We're talking about Italian opera arias, Hawaiian ukulele instrumentals, old Chet Baker recordings where the trumpet sounds like it's crying, and obscure acoustic tracks from artists most people have never Googled. He sits, sometimes on the floor, sometimes in a chair pushed into the farthest corner of the room, closes his eyes, and lets this music wash over him for 15 to 20 minutes straight. No phone scrolling. No conversation. No choreography review. Just Taehyung and a playlist that sounds like it belongs in a candlelit Parisian cafe, not a backstage area 30 minutes before pyrotechnics ignite in front of tens of thousands of screaming fans. And if you're wondering why jazz before a stadium pop concert? Why Sinatra before a BTS encore? The answer reveals something about V's artistry that most casual observers completely miss. Let's start with what this looks like to the people around him, because their reactions tell you everything about how unusual this ritual truly is. During the Love Yourself World Tour, a sound engineer who'd previously worked with several major Western artists, acts that regularly fill arenas and stadiums, told a Korean media outlet that in 20 years of touring, he'd never seen a performer pre-show routine quite like Taehyung's. Most artists, he explained, listen to their own music before a show to get in the zone. They want to feel the energy of the tracks they're about to perform, match their internal rhythm to the setlist's BPM, prime their adrenaline for the explosive opening number. Some listen to high-energy hip-hop or EDM to spike their heart rate. Others listen to their own vocals in rehearsal recordings to calibrate pitch and tone. What almost no one does is listen to a completely different emotional frequency, deliberately shifting their internal state away from the concert's energy before stepping into it. It's counterintuitive. It's almost contrarian. And according to Taehyung himself, it's the only thing that makes his performances feel real. In a 2019 Weverse magazine interview that remains one of the most candid glimpses into his creative philosophy, V explained, in characteristically elliptical fashion, that listening to emotionally rich, non-BTS music before a show helps him find the human part of the performance. He elaborated by saying that when you rehearse the same songs dozens or hundreds of times, there's a real danger of them becoming mechanical. Your body knows the moves, your voice knows the notes, but the feeling behind them starts to erode. The performance becomes technically perfect, but emotionally hollow. And for Taehyung, that hollowness is worse than a missed note or a botched dance step. He'd rather crack his voice on a high note because he's genuinely feeling something than deliver a flawless run that sounds like it was generated by a machine. The jazz and classical music he listens to before shows serves as an emotional reset. It pulls him out of idle mode and drops him back into human mode, reminding him what music is supposed to feel like before the industry's machinery processes it into choreography counts and light cues and camera angles. This philosophy didn't emerge in a vacuum. It was shaped by a childhood that was profoundly different from the typical K-pop trainee origin story. Kim Taehyung grew up in Gyeocheong, a rural area in South Gyeongsang province that's about as far from Seoul's entertainment district as you can get without leaving the country. His family was farming class. His grandmother, who played an enormous role in raising him, lived a life defined by seasonal rhythms and manual work, not pop culture or digital trends. Music entered Taehyung's world not through idol auditions or YouTube algorithm recommendations, but through his father's saxophone. His dad played saxophone as a hobby, and young Taehyung grew up falling asleep to the sound of jazz standards being practiced imperfectly in the next room. That sound, warm, breathy, slightly rough around the edges, imprinted on him at a neurological level, long before he knew what K-pop was, long before he understood what an idol even meant. When he listens to Chet Baker or Sinatra before a stadium show, he's not being pretentious or performatively eclectic. He's going home. He's returning to the emotional origin point where music first meant something to him, not as a product, not as a performance, but as a feeling that filled a small house in a farming village and made a kid feel like the world was bigger than the rice fields outside his window. The impact of this ritual on his actual stage presence is something that critics, fans, and fellow performers have all noted, even when they can't pinpoint exactly why. V has a quality on stage that is extremely difficult to articulate but immediately recognizable. A kind of emotional transparency that makes him feel less like a performer executing a show and more like a person experiencing something genuine in real time. Watch him during Singularity, the solo stage from the Love Yourself tour, and you'll see what I mean. The choreography is controlled, almost slow motion, and his facial expressions don't project outward toward the audience the way a trained idol typically would. Instead, they turn inward, as if he's reacting to something happening inside his own chest that the audience is only peripherally witnessing. That quality, that sense of private emotional experience made visible, is what makes fans describe V's performances as haunting or hypnotic rather than exciting or powerful. And it's directly traceable to the 20 minutes he spends before the show, disconnected from BTS's sonic world, floating in a completely different emotional atmosphere, absorbing textures and frequencies that soften the edges of his performance persona and let something more vulnerable bleed through. The other members have responded to this ritual with varying degrees of fascination and gentle teasing. Jungkook, who idolizes V and has described him as the member whose artistic instincts he trusts most, once said during a group interview that walking past Taehyung's pre-show listening session is like walking past a different dimension. He described hearing faint opera coming from Taehyung's headphones during the Map of the Soul tour and doing a literal double take because the emotional contrast between the aria and the stadium chaos happening on the other side of the wall was so surreal it felt like a scene from a movie. J-Hope, whose own pre-show energy is explosive and extroverted, has joked that if you combined his ritual with Taehyung's, you'd either create the perfect performer or cause a short circuit. RM, ever the intellectual, connected it to a broader artistic philosophy during a V Live, noting that Taehyung's instinct to seek emotional authenticity through unexpected musical sources is the same thing great actors do when they use sense memory. He's not preparing for the show, he's preparing to be honest during the show. That observation cuts to the heart of it. V's jazz habit isn't about taste or preference. It's about honesty. It's about refusing to let repetition kill the emotion. It's about walking on stage with a heart that's been freshly opened by a trumpet solo recorded in 1956, so that when he sings a lyric written in 2019, it feels like the first time, not the 500th. And there's one more detail that makes this ritual almost unbearably poignant. Staff members have noticed that V's playlist selections aren't random, they shift based on his emotional state. On nights when he's feeling nostalgic or homesick, the playlist skews toward older Korean ballads and his father's saxophone recordings. On nights when he's feeling anxious or overwhelmed by the scale of the event, it shifts toward slower, more ambient instrumentals, tracks with long, sustained notes that naturally slow down breathing and heart rate, functioning almost like a form of music therapy. On nights when he's feeling joyful and connected, it opens up to Hawaiian music, bossa nova, playful jazz that makes him nod his head and occasionally smile to himself with his eyes still closed. The playlist, in other words, is a mirror, and the music he chooses is his way of looking into it and acknowledging whatever he finds without flinching. In a world that constantly demands idols project confidence, energy, and perfection, Taehyung's ritual is a radical act of emotional honesty performed in private, with no audience, no cameras, and no expectation, just a man, his headphones, and the truth of how he feels in that specific moment on that specific night. Alright, now shift gears with me completely. Because if V's ritual is about softening himself before the stage, what happens when a member's ritual is about hardening? What if someone's pre-show routine is so physically brutal, so relentlessly demanding that his own trainer once asked him to stop and he refused? What if the sweat pouring off him before the first song isn't from nerves, it's from a workout that would break most professional athletes? Say next for number 3 and prepare yourself. This one is pure fire. Number 3, Jungkook, the workout that starts before the show even begins. Let me paint this picture for you, because unless you've seen it with your own eyes, you will not believe how extreme this is. 45 minutes before a BTS concert, while stylists are doing final touch-ups, while managers are running through logistics on their radios, while the dull roar of tens of thousands of fans is already shaking the walls of the backstage area, Jungkook drops to the floor and starts doing push-ups. Not 10, not 20, sets of 50, followed immediately by burpees, followed by jump squats, followed by core holds, followed by more push-ups. His shirt is drenched within minutes. The veins on his forearms are visible from across the room. His breathing is sharp and controlled, the kind of breathing you hear in a boxing gym, not a concert venue. Staff members who are new to the tour cycle inevitably stop and stare the first time they witness it, because what they're watching doesn't look like a warm-up. It looks like a full training session that most people would schedule as the main event of their fitness day. And Jungkook does this before performing a 2.5-hour concert that involves some of the most physically demanding choreography in live music. He enters the stage already at a level of physical exertion that would leave an average person ready for a nap, and he treats it as his starting line. This is not normal. This is not standard. And the reasons behind it go far deeper than vanity or fitness obsession. First, let's talk about what this routine actually consists of, because the details matter. According to multiple behind-the-scenes segments from BTS's concert documentaries, Burn the Stage, Break the Silence, and various tour vlogs, as well as accounts from their physical trainers and fellow members, Jungkook's pre-show workout follows a structure that has been refined over years. It begins with dynamic stretching, hip openers, shoulder rotations, ankle mobility work, all performed with an intensity and range of motion that immediately signals this is someone who understands his body at a near-athletic level. From there, he transitions into compound bodyweight movements, push-up variations targeting chest, shoulders, and triceps, deep squats with explosive jumps at the top, plank holds that he sustains for durations that make the members groan just watching. He sometimes adds resistance bands or light dumbbells if the venue's backstage area has space, but the core of the routine is bodyweight only, designed to be executable anywhere: a hotel hallway, a stadium loading dock, a cramped dressing room in an arena that wasn't built for global superstars. The entire session lasts between 20 and 30 minutes, and by the time it's done, Jungkook has elevated his heart rate to a zone that most fitness trackers would classify as vigorous cardio. He's flushed, he's breathing hard, and he looks like he just walked out of a CrossFit box, not into a concert where he'll need to dance, sing, and interact with a crowd for the next several hours. Now, the obvious question: why? Why would anyone voluntarily exhaust themselves before the main event? Isn't the whole point of pre-show preparation to conserve energy, not burn it? From a conventional standpoint, this ritual seems counterproductive, even reckless. And Jungkook's own trainers have apparently raised this concern more than once. In a candid moment captured during the Burn the Stage documentary series, a staff member can be seen approaching Jungkook mid-workout to suggest he take it easy tonight because the upcoming show was particularly long with additional encore songs. Jungkook listened politely, nodded, and went right back to his push-ups the moment the staff member walked away. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't arrogance. It was the unshakable conviction of someone who has tested the system in the crucible of hundreds of live performances and knows, with the certainty that only experience can provide, that it works. The science, it turns out, backs him up more than you might expect. There's a concept in exercise physiology called post-activation potentiation, or PAP, which describes the phenomenon where muscles perform better in a high-demand activity if they've been primed with a moderate to high-intensity effort shortly beforehand. The mechanism involves increased neural drive and enhanced muscle fiber recruitment. Essentially, when you push your muscles hard and then allow a brief recovery window, the motor units wake up and fire more efficiently during the subsequent activity. Athletes in track and field, swimming, and martial arts use this principle routinely. Sprinters will do heavy squats an hour before a race, knowing that the residual neural activation will make their legs more explosive when they hit the blocks. What Jungkook has intuitively built into his pre-show routine is a version of this same principle, adapted for the unique demands of a BTS concert, which requires explosive power, jumping choreography, sustained endurance, 2+ hours of continuous movement, and fine motor control, hitting precise formations while singing live. By preloading his muscles with intense work and then giving himself a 15 to 20-minute cool-down window before the show starts, he's essentially overclocking his physical hardware for the performance ahead. But the physiology is only half the story. The other half is psychological, and it's rooted in something Jungkook has carried with him since he was literally a child. Jungkook auditioned for the Korean talent competition Superstar K in 2011 when he was 13 years old. He didn't win. He didn't even make it particularly far. But 7 entertainment companies offered him trainee contracts based on his audition tape, and he chose Big Hit Entertainment, reportedly because he was inspired by watching RM perform. He moved to Seoul alone at 14, leaving his family in Busan, and entered a training system designed to break down and rebuild young people into performance machines. The physical demands were relentless. Hours of dance practice daily, vocal training, fitness regimens, all while attending school and navigating the emotional minefield of adolescence far from home. But here's the critical detail: Jungkook was the youngest trainee, the maknae. And while that role comes with a certain amount of affectionate coddling in Korean group culture, it also comes with an unspoken pressure to prove that you deserve your spot, that you're not just the baby of the group being carried by the older, more experienced members. This pressure was compounded by the fact that Jungkook was genuinely extraordinary, a natural singer, a fast-learning dancer, a visual that fit the industry's standards, which created an internal expectation loop that has driven him his entire career. If I can do everything well, I must do everything perfectly. The pre-show workout is, at its core, a physical expression of that psychological need. It's not just about warming up the muscles. It's about proving to himself, in the most tangible way possible, that his body is ready, that he has left no preparation stone unturned, that the performance he's about to give will be limited only by the moment's inspiration, never by physical inadequacy. The members' relationship with Jungkook's pre-show workout has evolved from concern to amusement to genuine admiration. In early tour cycles, several members, particularly Jin and J-Hope, would actively try to get him to stop, worried that he was draining energy he'd need on stage. Jimin, who shares Jungkook's perfectionist streak when it comes to physical performance, was reportedly the first member to stop trying to intervene, understanding instinctively that the ritual served a purpose beyond the physical. Over time, even the members who initially found it excessive came to recognize it as essential to Jungkook's performance identity. V once said, with his characteristic blend of admiration and blunt honesty, that Jungkook doesn't feel like himself on stage unless he's already conquered something before the lights come on. That observation is deceptively profound. It captures the essence of a performer who has psychologically wired himself to require a pre-show victory, a physical challenge met and overcome, before he can access the version of himself that the audience expects. The workout isn't preparation, it's proof. It's a receipt that says, I earned this. I bled for this before a single fan saw me tonight. Number 2, Jimin, the final rehearsal that never feels final. There is a hallway or a corner or a patch of empty floor behind a curtain, or sometimes literally the wing of the stage itself, where, in the last 20 minutes before every BTS concert, Park Jimin can be found doing something that would make most professional dancers either deeply inspired or genuinely uncomfortable. He's rehearsing. Not the full set list. Not even a full song. He's rehearsing one move. One transition. One single 8-count sequence that, to the untrained eye, already looks flawless. And he's doing it again. And again. And again. And again. His reflection in the dark glass of a backstage monitor, or in the screen of a propped-up phone filming himself, is his only audience. His face isn't calm. It isn't relaxed. His brow is furrowed in that specific way ARMY knows too well, the expression of a man engaged in a war against the millimeter gap between what his body just did and what his brain demanded it do. Staff members have counted. Members have counted. On certain nights, Jimin has repeated the same isolated movement over 40 times in a row in those final pre-show minutes. 40 repetitions of a sequence that lasts maybe 3 seconds. And each time, he watches the playback, identifies something, a wrist angle 2 degrees off, a head turn that arrived a 16th of a beat late, a weight transfer that shifted to the wrong foot for half a breath, resets, and goes again. This isn't warm-up. This isn't practice. This is something far more complex, far more psychologically loaded, and far more central to understanding why Park Jimin is widely regarded as one of the greatest live performers of his generation. Let's be precise about what we're witnessing here, because the distinction matters enormously. Every dancer warms up before a performance. Every professional rehearses. What Jimin does is qualitatively different. It's not about getting his body ready. It's about satisfying a standard that exists nowhere except inside his own mind. The choreography has already been rehearsed to death during weeks of formal practice. The group has run through it together. The formations are set, the timing is locked, the music cues are second nature. By any professional measure, the work is done. But for Jimin, done is a concept that simply does not apply to movement. There is always a refinement to be made. Always a line that could be cleaner. Always an angle that could be sharper. Always a moment of physical expression that could carry one more degree of emotional weight. And so he stands in that hallway alone, 20 minutes from showtime, hunting for imperfections that no audience member would ever detect, and pouring everything he has into eliminating them anyway. The roots of this obsession trace back to a place that's both geographically and emotionally distant from the glittering stages of BTS's world tours. Park Jimin grew up in Busan, South Korea's second largest city, and from a young age, he was drawn to dance with an intensity that surprised even his family. But here's the critical detail that shapes everything. Jimin didn't start as a K-pop style dancer. He trained in contemporary dance at the Busan High School of Arts, one of the most prestigious performing arts programs in the country. Contemporary dance is a fundamentally different discipline from idol choreography. It prizes emotional expression over precision, fluidity over sharpness, the communication of internal states through the body's vocabulary. It's closer to theater than to the synchronized, military precision formations of K-pop. When Jimin entered Big Hit Entertainment as a trainee, he was walking into a world that valued the exact opposite of what he'd been trained to prioritize, and the collision between these two systems created a tension inside him that has never fully resolved. On one hand, his contemporary training gave him a physical expressiveness that is unmatched in the idol industry, the way his body tells stories, the way a single hand gesture can carry the emotional weight of an entire lyric. The way he moves as if the music is literally pulling him through space rather than counting him through steps. On the other hand, it made the precise, synchronized, beat-perfect demands of K-pop choreography feel like a constant test he was never quite passing, because his body instinctively wanted to interpret rather than replicate. This internal conflict is the engine behind the pre-show rehearsal ritual. When Jimin isolates a single move and repeats it 40 times, he's not practicing in the traditional sense. He's negotiating between two artistic languages that live inside his body simultaneously. He's trying to achieve a moment where the precision demanded by the choreography and the emotional expression demanded by his training converge perfectly, where the angle of his arm is geometrically exact and emotionally resonant, where the timing of his step hits the beat with mechanical accuracy and feels organically connected to the music's emotional current. That convergence, when it happens, is what makes Jimin's performances look superhuman. It's why fans describe watching him dance as watching someone who was born inside the song. It's why choreographers who've worked with BTS consistently single him out as the member who adds dimensions to their work that they didn't even choreograph, subtle textural details, micro-expressions of the body that elevate a good routine into something transcendent. But achieving that convergence is brutally difficult, and it requires recalibration before every single show because the variables change nightly. The stage surface affects traction, the humidity affects muscle responsiveness, the altitude affects breathing. And most importantly, Jimin's own emotional state affects, which artistic instinct dominates on any given night. The psychological cost of this perfectionism is something Jimin has been more openly honest about than almost any performer at his level. In multiple interviews, V-Lives, and in the raw confessional footage captured in BTS's documentary series, Jimin has spoken about the dark side of his obsession with movement precision. During the Wings tour in 2017, there were nights where his post-show emotional state swung violently depending on whether he felt he'd met his own standard. A show that fans called incredible could leave Jimin silent and withdrawn backstage because he'd felt a moment in blood, sweat, and tears where his body hadn't fully committed to a fall, or a section in Lie, where his spin had lost a fraction of its axis control. Members have described finding him alone after concerts, watching fancam footage on his phone with an expression that RM once described as a surgeon reviewing an operation tape, clinical, dissecting, unforgiving. The infamous moment in Burn the Stage, where Jimin broke down in tears backstage because he felt his performance hadn't met his own expectations despite the audience's ecstatic response, wasn't an isolated incident of emotional exhaustion. It was a visible eruption of a pressure system that operates inside him constantly, and the pre-show rehearsal ritual is both a symptom of and a partial solution to that pressure. By obsessively refining one element, just one, before the show, Jimin gives himself a small island of control in an ocean of variables he can't manage. He can't control the acoustics, the crowd energy, the temperature, or his own unpredictable emotional state. But he can control whether that one transition in Fake Love is executed to his satisfaction. And that small victory, that tiny proof of mastery, is often enough to quiet the inner critic long enough for him to walk on stage and surrender to the performance. The other members' response to Jimin's ritual reveals the depth of their understanding of him as both an artist and a person. J-Hope, as BTS's dance leader and the member with the most technical authority to comment on choreographic precision, has said something that cuts to the absolute core of Jimin's psychology. Jimin doesn't practice because he's not good enough. He practices because he can feel the difference between 99% and 100%, and that 1% keeps him up at night. Think about the weight of that statement. Most people in most disciplines can't perceive the difference between 99% and 100% execution. Their bodies aren't calibrated finely enough. Their artistic sensitivity isn't tuned to that resolution. But Jimin can feel it in his muscles, in his proprioceptive awareness, in that sixth sense that elite performers develop, where the body itself becomes an instrument of measurement. And because he can feel that 1% gap, he cannot ignore it. It would be like asking a musician with perfect pitch to ignore an instrument that's a quarter tone flat, technically possible, but psychologically agonizing. Jungkook, who shares Jimin's relentless drive, but channels it primarily through physical conditioning rather than technical refinement, once said that watching Jimin's pre-show rehearsals taught him that there's a level of caring about your craft that goes beyond effort. It's closer to love, and love doesn't know when to stop. V, who rooms with Jimin and has witnessed this ritual more closely than perhaps anyone, has described it with poignant simplicity. Jimin IE isn't afraid of the stage. He's afraid of not being worthy of it. Number 1, J-Hope, the fire that turns 7 into 1. Every single ritual we've talked about, Jin's jokes, Suga's silence, RM's whispered words, V's private playlist, Jungkook's punishing workout, Jimin's obsessive rehearsal, all of those happen in isolation. They are individual survival mechanisms, personal anchors that each member drops into the storm of pre-show chaos to keep himself steady. But there is a moment, one single moment, that takes all 7 of those individual threads and weaves them into a rope strong enough to pull 80,000 people into a shared emotional experience for the next 3 hours. And that moment belongs to young Hoseok. Because approximately 2 minutes before BTS walks on stage, every ritual stops. Every headphone comes off. Every phone goes down. Every repetition ceases. The 7 members come together in a tight circle, shoulder to shoulder, arms intertwined, heads bowed, and J-Hope takes over. What happens next is not a chant. It's not a cheer. It's a detonation. And the man holding the trigger is the one member who has spent his entire life learning how to turn his own energy into everyone else's fuel. Here's what it looks like, stripped of all romantic framing. The members gather, usually in the final staging area just steps from the stage entrance. The noise of the crowd is already bleeding through the walls, a low, omnipresent rumble that vibrates in the chest like a second heartbeat. The lighting backstage is dim, functional, unglamorous. Cables snake across the floor. Stage managers speak in clipped tones through headsets. The air smells like hairspray, sweat, and electrical equipment. Into this industrial chaos, 7 men form a circle so tight their foreheads nearly touch. And then J-Hope speaks. Not softly. Not gently. He speaks with a force that staff members standing 15 feet away have described as physically startling, a voice that comes from somewhere deeper than the throat, powered by a diaphragm that's been trained by years of dance and vocal performance, carrying an intensity that is almost aggressive in its positivity. The words vary from night to night, but the structure is remarkably consistent. He calls out the city they're in. He calls out the fans waiting beyond the curtain. He names what they're about to do, not generically, but specifically, with the kind of urgency that makes it sound like tonight is the only night that matters, like every show before this was practice and this one is the real thing. And then he launches into the call and response that has become BTS's most iconic backstage tradition, Bangtan. And 6 voices answer, Bangtan. Again. Bang bang Bangtan. Fists pump. Voices crack with adrenaline. And in that final second, J-Hope lets out a scream, a raw, throat-shredding, primal sound that has no words, only energy, and the circle explodes outward as 7 men turn toward the stage entrance and walk into the light. Now, you might be thinking, every group does some version of a pre-show huddle. Every sports team circles up before the game. What makes this different? The answer is J-Hope himself, specifically, the almost supernatural ability he possesses to manipulate the emotional energy of a room through sheer force of personality, and the deeply personal history that turned that ability from a natural gift into a refined weapon. Young Hoseok grew up in Gwangju, a city in southwestern South Korea that carries enormous historical and emotional weight in Korean culture. Gwangju is the site of the 1980 Gwangju Uprising, a pro-democracy movement that was violently suppressed by the military government, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of civilians. The city's identity is built on resistance, on collective action, on the belief that individual voices become powerful only when they merge into a unified roar. Whether consciously or not, that cultural DNA runs through J-Hope's approach to group dynamics. He doesn't just understand collective energy, he feels it as a moral imperative. The group must be united. The group must feel like one organism. And if they don't, it's his job to fix it before anyone sets foot on that stage. Before BTS, Hoseok was a street dancer, a standout member of a Gwangju dance crew called Neuron, where he developed a reputation not just for his technical skill, but for his ability to hype up other dancers before battles and showcases. Street dance culture is inherently communal. It's about the crew, the circle, the shared energy that makes a freestyle cypher feel electric. Hoseok didn't just learn choreography in those years. He learned how to be a human amplifier. Someone who takes whatever energy exists in a room and multiplies it, reflects it back, raises its temperature until everyone around him feels more alive, more capable, more fearless than they did 30 seconds ago. When he entered Big Hit as a trainee and was eventually positioned as BTS's main dancer and de facto energy center, he wasn't stepping into a role that was assigned to him. He was stepping into a role he'd already been performing his entire life. The pre-show huddle is the purest expression of that role, distilled into 2 minutes of concentrated emotional alchemy. But here's the part that nobody talks about enough, the cost. Because here's the truth about J-Hope that the bright smile and explosive energy often obscure. He is, by his own admission, one of the most anxiety-prone members of BTS. This isn't speculation or fan interpretation. It's something Hoseok has addressed directly in interviews, in music, and in some of the most gut-wrenchingly honest moments captured in BTS's documentaries. In Burn the Stage, there's a scene that has become legendary among ARMY, J-Hope sitting backstage after a performance, his stage persona completely dissolved, crying quietly as the adrenaline crash hits him. The contrast between the man who was screaming Bangtan with volcanic energy 20 minutes earlier and the man sitting alone with tears on his cheeks is so stark it feels like watching two different people occupy the same body. And there you have it. 7 members, 7 rituals, 7 completely different answers to the same terrifying question. How do you walk into a wall of sound and light and expectation and not lose yourself? Jin answers with laughter. A psychological circuit breaker disguised as the worst jokes you've ever heard, deployed with the precision of a man who understood, years before anyone else noticed, that his greatest contribution to BTS might not be his voice, but his ability to make 6 other people breathe again. Suga answers with silence. 90 minutes of total neural immersion, mentally performing the entire concert before a single spotlight turns on, building a fortress of preparation so complete that the live show becomes a confirmation rather than a test. RM answers with words spoken to no one but himself, a nightly negotiation between the kid from Ilson who was told he wasn't enough and the leader of a global movement who still isn't entirely sure the universe made the right call. V answers with music that has nothing to do with BTS, jazz, opera, old Hawaiian recordings that smell like his father's saxophone and his grandmother's house, pulling him back to the emotional ground zero where music was just a feeling, not a career, not a brand, not a responsibility. Jungkook answers with sweat, a pre-show workout so brutal that his own trainers have begged him to stop, born from the relentless internal engine of a golden magne who has never once in his life been satisfied with being good enough. Jimin answers with repetition, 40 attempts at the same 3-second movement, hunting a convergence between technical precision and emotional truth that exists in a margin so thin only he can perceive it, and only he can close it. And J-Hope answers with fire, a 2-minute explosion of collective energy that takes 7 separate people, each carrying their own private fears and fragile preparations, and welds them into a single unstoppable force that walks toward 80,000 strangers like they're walking home. What's extraordinary isn't any one of these rituals in isolation. It's that they coexist, that a group can contain someone who needs absolute silence and someone who needs explosive noise, someone who needs physical exhaustion and someone who needs emotional stillness, someone who talks to himself and someone who talks to everyone. And somehow, miraculously, all of these contradictions resolve into the same 2-minute huddle, the same scream, the same walk toward the same stage, night after night, year after year, across every continent and every time zone and every possible emotional condition a human being can carry into a performance. That's not teamwork. That's not chemistry. That's not even talent. That's 7 people who have each found their own way to be brave, and then chosen, every single night, to combine those separate braveries into something the world has never seen before and may never see again. And that right there is why BTS isn't just a group. They're a phenomenon. They're proof that the most powerful performance in the world doesn't start when the music drops, it starts in a hallway, in a mirror, in a pair of headphones, on a concrete floor, in a whispered sentence, in a terrible joke, and in a scream that shakes the walls before the audience hears a single note. Thank you for staying until the very end. This has been 7 things BTS members always do before stepping on stage.